That age where I have to take my glasses off to see things down. So when I'm like that, I'm intellectual. And when I'm like that, I'm stupid, so I apologise. My theme today is obviously honouring your father and mother. And my sort of subtext is, I love you very much. That's what God is saying to each and every one of us in this room today, whether we're a believer or not a believer. I love you very much. And the picture I'd like you to take, if there's one picture I'd like you to take, it's just like when you were learning to walk as a young child, your mother or father would put their hand down to hold your hand. And as you got older, you didn't need to hold their hand anymore. Every day, beside each one of us, God is walking beside us and opening up his hand. And it's our choice whether we hold his hand on our daily walk or whether we refuse that hand. Okay? That's a choice we make. So, honouring your father and mother. Well, just before we get into the main talk, there are two things this week which have touched me on this theme. The first was, the Hardys watched a great film last night, which comes as a recommendation, which is Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Now, some of us of a certain age will remember that film. It's a lovely film with Sidney Poitier and Spencer Tracy and Catherine Hepburn. And it's about a very young liberal family living in San Francisco, where we're lucky enough to be going on holiday, which is why we watched the film. And the daughter arrives with a handsome new boyfriend that she is going to marry, who's a black guy. But the theme throughout the whole of the film, and it is a film full of love, is about honouring your father and mother. So if ever you're looking for a film to watch on a Saturday night, love film, you can download Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. The second thing, just in terms of introduction, because I'm going to talk a bit about Johnny Cash as well later. So if you're a Johnny Cash fan, he's coming later. Okay? The second thought was, I do quite a bit of driving, and I was driving around this week and listening to Radio 5, and Nicky Campbell had a little spot on it, which was around what you would write to your 11-year-old self. And lots of people phoned up and talked about what lessons from life they would write to their 11-year-old self. And that's quite an interesting thing for each of us to do. What would you write to your 11-year-old self as a lesson for life? But you know the most popular theme that came up? Mum was right. Okay? There were women of 70 phoning up. There were men and women in their 50s and younger. And the biggest takeout of that bit of the programme was Mum did know best. Now, when you're growing up, you don't believe any of that stuff. You know, when you become a teenager, it becomes a nonsense, the idea that your mum and dad actually do know what they're talking about. But if there's one thing about this commandment, is we all have mums and dads. Okay? We all have mums and dads. I don't expect many of us to have broken the commandment, thou shalt not kill. Okay? If you're in the military, if you're in a maximum security ward in a prison somewhere, maybe, but generally we don't go around killing people. Generally we don't go around committing adultery. But this is a universally applicable and relevant commandment. Now, as some of you know, and Alistair mentioned it, there's a group of men that meet every Thursday, and we're reading the Bible in a year. It's a tough gig, and some of us are doing really well, and some of us are doing extremely well. And I'm at the back. But the interesting thing about reading the Bible in a year is it really does give you a perspective, an overall perspective on stuff. And one of the interesting things about the commandments is the commandments are given 3 times in the Bible. First time the commandments are given is to Adam. Okay? It was only one commandment. Okay? Only one instruction. Don't eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge. Okay? It wasn't a long list, it was just one commandment. Okay? 2 days later, it all goes wrong. Then we've got the 10 Commandments, given in Exodus. Okay? Moses is up at Mount Sinai, okay, getting the commandments and the instructions. God has brought everyone out of Israel. Moses says, stay down at the bottom of the mountain. I'm going up to talk to God. He's going to give me the instructions, and I'm going to come down and talk to you. What do? Have a big party. Don't think Moses is coming back. Forget everything that God's done for them and build a graven image. Moses comes down with the 10 Commandments, see what's going on, almost can't believe it, breaks the 2 tablets of stone in disgust. Okay? That lasted about a day, okay, before everything went wrong. And the third time the commandments are given is in Jerusalem, where the Lord gives the absolute essence of all the commandments. Okay? Thou shalt love the Lord God with all your heart and with all your soul. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is thou shalt love thy neighbour. Okay? The thing that separates Christianity from and the commandments from just sensible rules of life is that first one, that the priority is loving God with all your heart and all your soul. Okay? So when I've come and had a thought about the father and mother and honouring them, it's important to remember that we're probably very blessed in this room in terms of our family groups. But I'm really conscious, and the more I prayed about this commandment, the more I realised that many people have had really troubled relationships with their mums and dads. Okay? Really troubled. Not just falling out because, the bedroom is untidy or they're eating food in their bedroom, and particularly if they're a boy, they're hiding stuff under the pillow and they never do what they're told. I mean, real serious problems with their parents. Some people have got poor relationships now with their parents. Not everyone has a loving nuclear family. That's not the reality. And that's a sadness about the modern world. But the reality is we all have parents. Okay? We're all children and we all have a father and a mother. And so making sure this sort of commandment is relevant to each of us is incredibly important. So the way I want to cut it up is from 3 perspectives. One is from the child's perspective, honouring your father and mother. Secondly, the parent's perspective. And thirdly, God's perspective. Now, when I look at the child's perspective, the Bible's really clear on the importance of honouring your father and mother. If you read the Bible, you really can't escape. You should do what your mum and dad say. There's lots of stuff in obedience. And being an obedient child to your parents in Colossians 6 is pleasing to God. So unfortunately, guys, okay, he said, looking at all those who are younger initially, okay, you need to honour your father and mother and aim to be obedient. You need to be grateful, because that rap video, which I loved, as a child, until you have your own children, you have no concept whatsoever of the sacrifices your mum and dad make. Whether it's financial sacrifices, okay, putting the child first, whether it's emotional sacrifices, whether it's waking up in the middle of the night to change a nappy, okay, when you're dog-tired and you know you've got a meeting the following day. Your parents make phenomenal sacrifices. The second thing, apart from being grateful, is don't mock them. That sort of cockiness that often teenagers get. Yeah, okay. Yeah, whatever. Okay? In Proverbs 30 is good to read. Okay? It's very clear. God doesn't approve of a mocking eye. And showing respect to your elders. As Leviticus 19 is lovely about elders. But being respectful, even when you've got older parents, being respectful to them, okay, is incredibly important. I remember my dad had Alzheimer's. Both my mum and dad have gone, but my dad had Alzheimer's. And every day I'd phone Dad up. And his Alzheimer's was a happy Alzheimer's, but he'd get confused. So I'd phone him up and I'd say, "How are things today, Dad?" And he'd say, "Things are great, son." He was always very positive, my dad. But the TV stopped working. So I'd say to him, "Dad, what do you mean the TV stopped working?" He said, "I don't know why, son, but the TV, I'm going to need to get a new TV." So I'd say to him, "Dad, when you look at the TV, is there a little red light on?" And he'd say, "No, it's not working." And I'd say, "Well, Dad, there's a big button, okay, on-off button, next to where that little light should be. Just go over and press it for me, will you?" 3 seconds later, "It's working now, son." Okay? I'd say, "That's great, Dad." We'd have that conversation twice a week. The other frequent conversation we'd have is, "Hi, Dad, I can't hear you, son." "Dad, I can't hear you, son." "Dad, try turning the phone round the other way." Okay? "I can hear you now, son." Okay? We'd have that conversation a couple of days a week. Okay? And it would be really understandable at one level to get frustrated and irritated at having to explain again and again what, has just been said a few minutes ago. But I know, and each of us know, when we were that high, time and time again you have to explain to a child. Okay? That's what parents should do. Okay? So I want to move now on to parents. Now, it's quite easy when you read that commandment to forget that it's a two-way traffic. The sort of secular phrase, "you earn respect," is relevant in this regard. But parents, I've been horrified over the last few weeks, absolutely horrified at the statistics on child abuse from parents. The numbers, the more you look into it, are horrific. We may be very blessed in this congregation, but there will be communities where child abuse is prevalent. 1 in 20 children suffer sexual child abuse. 1 in 5 suffer some form of sexual, physical, or emotional abuse. Okay? That is a terrible indictment on our society. God tells us, the Lord tells us, put the children first. Feed the children first. Your primary obligation as a parent is to put your children first. They didn't ask to be born. They didn't ask to come in this world. That was a parent's decision. And as soon as the parents made that decision, it's our obligation. God gives us that responsibility to put our children first. Not to please ourselves, but to put our children first. And that's a tough gig. When you're rock bottom tired, that's a tough gig. But that's our obligation, once we've brought them into the world, to put the children first. And again, anyone under the age of sort of 15, you have no idea how generally your parents put you first before themselves. Okay? Your dad might really want a classic sports car, but he can't afford it because he's paying for all the things you want in your life. Okay? But it's a parent's obligation to put the children first and to look after them and to love them. And that sort of moves me on to God's perspective on all of this. Because as a parent, the frustrations you feel with your kids are sometimes unbelievable. How many times do I have to tell you to tidy up your room? How many times do I have to tell you to take your elbows off the table? How many times do I have to tell you to be nice to your nan and granddad? How many times do I have to tell you to do your homework? How many times do I have to tell you, put the iPad down and let's have a conversation? How many times do I have to tell you, you don't play with your phone at the table when we're eating? Okay? Now, God understands that. Because you go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And God made Adam and Eve. Whether you believe that's just a figurative description or whether you actually believe that's correct, that God breathed into the soul, breathed a soul into a Homo sapien. God gave only one instruction. You can do what you like. Just don't eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And man lets him down. Later on, God takes the people of Israel out of Egypt. He sorts Pharaoh out. He divides the Red Sea. He brings them salvation. And he says, just stay down there. Moses is going to come up. I'm going to give you the 10 commandments on which to organise yourself. Just be patient. What do? They're having a big party. All of the Old Testament is about God's journey with the Israelites and his continued disappointment at them letting him down. Until finally, God the Father has to send his Son. God the Father totally understands how tough it is to be a father, to be a parent. But through all of that time, God the Father has held out his hand and said, hold my hand and I'll walk with you. All you have to do is to make the choice to hold my hand and walk with me. But more than that, God understands what it means to be a child. One of the things that always amazed me the first time I read the New Testament was, why did Jesus choose to be born, because he could have chosen another place to be born, choose to be born into a carpenter's family? I mean, there he is, King of Kings and Lord of Lords in heaven at the right-hand side of God. You would expect the Son of God to be born into a palace. But instead, he gets born into a carpenter's household. Okay? My son has to go to work. It's not that he's being disrespectful. Okay? I know that. Okay? Nice to see you, son. Go and wash some dishes. £3.50 an hour. I assume you're getting more than that, Matt. But now he's gone. You can tell me about that later. But God the Son, Jesus, chose to be born into a carpenter's household. He chose to be obedient to Mary and Joseph. In the New Testament, you don't hear anything about Joseph, really. But even at Cana, when Mary comes along and realises they've run out of wine, and comes along to Jesus and says, look, can you please change some water into wine? And the Lord says, it's not my time yet. But he still does it for his mum. When, at about the age of 11, he's in Jerusalem, and he's in the temple, and he's elucidating on the scriptures. Okay? Again, as soon as he realises his mum and dad are worried, he just goes with them. He's obedient. God understands what it's like to be a child. It's really important, again, if you're under about the age of 15, to think that God doesn't understand what it's like to be young. He totally understands what it's like to be young. He's been there. But he's been there in circumstances far tougher than any of the children in Claverdon. Trust me, being a carpenter's son in the Middle East, 2,000 odd years ago, would have been practically a tough gig. A lot tougher than living in a nice house in Claverdon in a nice village. God understands what it's like to be a child. So we have a God in heaven who knows what it's like to be a parent and what it's like to be a child. Okay? And he's holding out his hand now and saying to you, throughout every day of your life, am going to walk beside you. Whether you know I'm there or not. Whether you know I'm there or not, I'm walking beside you. And every moment of every day, I'm holding my hand out and saying, do you want to hold my hand? And we'll walk together. And I'll look after you. If you choose not to hold his hand, the consequences will be yours. But none of us should ever doubt that God walks beside us every day, holding out his hand, wanting us to hold hands with him. Just the same way your mum and dad did for you when you were learning to walk. Now there are three other things that have happened or relevant to this, the wrap on this. The first is a lovely story which I was going to tell whether Robbie was here or not. But sometimes when you come to church, you wonder, well, actually, it's all very nice. People are very nice. Maybe the talk, maybe not on this occasion, is interesting. But how much does God really walk beside us? Okay? How much can I really believe in the reality of God? And Robbie and I often have conversations of such like as he's growing into manhood. And I was talking to him the other day about how unusual it is to meet someone where God has spoken to them. And I said, generally, Robbie, if someone says God's speaking to them, treat them with a degree of suspicion because they might be a bit of a nutter. Okay? Just as an aside, you may not know, I used to be the optician to the most dangerous man in the UK, who's called Charles Bronson, who's an interesting individual, who is in the maximum security prison in the UK, who has an interesting line in covering himself in butter so that when he gets very violent, okay, the guards try to stop him and they slip off because he's covered in butter. He wrote to me when I was chairman at Dolland and Aitchison and said, "Dear Mr. Hardy, my name's Charles Bronson. I'm in the maximum security ward. You're my optician. I wanted to thank you at how good an optician Dolland and Aitchison was." Okay. Now, Charles Bronson believes God speaks to him a lot. And it was with that in mind that I said to Robbie, treat with suspicion people who say God speaks to them a lot. It doesn't happen a lot. God whispers. But Robbie said, well, Dad, actually, it's interesting. My best friend at school's mum is called Zelda. Zelda is a cancer survivor, and she took up doing Ironmen after surviving cancer. And Robbie said she was doing a triathlon and God spoke to her. So I'm doing breakfast. And I said, sorry? And he said, Zelda was doing a triathlon and God said to her, I want you to speak to the woman that you're about to overtake. So she's running the section of the triathlon. I want you to speak to the woman who you're about to overtake. And so as she overtook her, she held the woman's hand and said, I know this will sound strange, but God has just spoken to me and told me to speak to you now. And the woman broke down in tears. And she said, I was a vicar's wife. My husband died 6 months ago. I'm losing my faith. I'm doing this run in honor of my husband. You have no idea how much your words mean. Okay? Now, that's a woman who lives in Warwick. If ever you're around with me, I'll introduce you. But when people say, does God exist? Okay? Apart from the experiences a number of us will know in our own lives, but have a word with Zelda. That's the first thing. The second thing is the assumption you've got tomorrow to think about all of this stuff. Kim and I had a very different Friday night from the one we were expecting. We were invited round for Barbie, round at some friends. And so we went along, and our friends arrived, and then after about 15 minutes, I think I was on my third glass of bubbles, which was unwise, someone came along and said, are you a first aider? And I said no. But I went in, and a woman had fallen from the top of the stairs on her heels, straight down, split open her head, and had broken her neck. Okay? The woman's a GP, and we spent Friday night stabilising her neck and taking her to hospital. Now, fortunately, she's very lucky. If she'd been moved, and that's a lesson from life, if ever you find someone who's smashed their neck, never move them. If she had been moved, she would have been a paraplegic now. Okay? She wasn't moved, and she was operated on yesterday. But the relevance of that is in an instant. She hadn't had anything to drink. She was just wearing high heels. Other learning point. Okay? David, stop wearing the high heels. You'll fall off them. But the second point is never assume you've got tomorrow. You haven't got tomorrow. You've only got today. So think about that hand. And are you going to take that hand? It doesn't take a lot. All it takes is to say, God, I recognise not everything's perfect in my life. Okay? And I'm sorry for that. Secondly, thank you for Jesus. I know he was your son. Thank you for the sacrifice he made on the cross to take the punishment for my wrongdoings. And thank you for rising him up to life. Okay? If all you do is say that, you're saved. Whatever happens in your life, Alzheimer's, whatever, cancer, whatever, you're saved. You're sorted. You're in eternity with him. My final thought, and I know some of you have been waiting this, is Johnny Cash. Now, I'm a big Johnny Cash fan. Okay? The Johnny Cash gospel albums are some of the best gospel albums you can get. The thing I love about Johnny Cash is he wasn't perfect. He knew he wasn't perfect. He accepted he wasn't perfect. But boy, oh boy, did he know he had a saviour in the Lord Jesus Christ. But he did a song called A Boy Named Sue. Now, I'm not sure how many of you either know that song or know the story behind that song. But the story behind that song was someone he knew who wrote children's books, gave him a poem with that song on it. And Johnny Cash used to go into prisons, went into Folsom Prison, went into San Quentin Prison. And when he was at San Quentin, he just got the poem out, put it down, and said to his band, play something in A. Now that will mean something to you. It means absolutely nothing to me. Okay? Play something in A. And so they started to play the tune of A Boy Named Sue. And Johnny Cash just read the poem out as a song. That's how it was recorded. Okay? But A Boy Named Sue, and this is relevant to all of those, I think, who maybe have had more of a troubled time with parents, is A Boy Named Sue. The song is about a father who calls his son Sue. Okay? And the boy grows up being called Sue. And he has to fight a lot because people take the mick at school because his name's Sue. He grows up to be tough because his name's Sue. And he decides he's going to find his father who called him Sue because he's so angry that he was called Sue. And eventually he meets his father and has a fight. And his father turns round to him and says, son, I called you Sue because I thought I was doing the right thing for you. I knew I wouldn't be around. I thought it was the right thing for you. And quite often with parents, they think they're doing the right thing, even though the consequences aren't right. And this will probably be the only time you'll hear me quote the Quran when I'm giving a Bible talk. But the Quran's version of honour your father and mother is be kind to your father and mother. Be kind. And even when you've had a really tough time with your parents, a bit like a boy named Sue, just try and be kind. Because probably they haven't held that hand which is being offered to them. Okay? We all make mistakes. As parents, we will make mistakes. It's called life. But trust me, our intentions most of the time are good. As children, all of us, particularly if our parents are elderly, treat them with respect because they put you first. Thank you very much. And if you want to borrow a Johnny Cash gospel album, okay, September the 6th, I'll lend you one of mine. Thank you very much.